William Derren Hask wasn't just a builder. He was a silent architect of horror. For years, he moved through neighborhoods unnoticed, designing a secret prison beneath a burned-out house in Pine Grove, where muffled screams were the only clue to the nightmare below. When Officer Denise Harrow followed those faint cries, she uncovered more than just missing men. She uncovered a twisted plan years in the making, a predator still on the run. In the peaceful town of Pine Grove, nothing ever seemed out of place. It was the kind of place where neighbors waved at each other every morning, where kids rode bikes until sunset, and where the most excitement anyone got was the occasional power outage or a stray dog on the loose. But all of that changed one quiet Monday night in early October. Officer Denise Harrow, a local patrol cop known for her strict routines, was doing her usual late-night drive around the older part of town. The houses there were spaced farther apart, and some properties had been abandoned for years, left to nature and decay.
Ow.
As she rolled past the charred remains of an old house on Halbert Street, a place left empty since a fire gutted it 2 years prior, she noticed something. At first it was faint, almost indistinguishable from the night wind. But when she turned down her car's radio and lowered the window, she heard it again, a stifled, almost inhuman sound. It wasn't yelling or crying exactly. It was something between a groan and a plea. Instinct kicked in. She turned off the car completely, sat still and waited. There it was again. Muffled screams, distant and rhythmic. Not once, not twice, but spaced apart in eerie, uneven intervals. Denise stepped out of the vehicle and scanned the dark surroundings. The lot was overgrown with weeds, and part of the old structure still stood, blackened and unstable. Her flashlight cut through the darkness, but there was no sign of movement. She radioed for backup, her voice calm but tense. While waiting, she moved cautiously toward the back of the property. There, behind a row of rotting garden beds and partially buried under an old pile of scrap metal and fallen branches, something caught her attention. A rusted steel handle jutting from the ground.
Oh.
Kneeling beside it, she cleared away the debris, revealing what looked like a trap door. The edges were covered in moss, and it had clearly been there for years, unnoticed and untouched. She tried lifting it, but it wouldn't budge. When backup arrived minutes later, 2 officers helped pry the hatch open. A gust of damp, sour air escaped, strong enough to make them all step back. Beneath the door was a narrow shaft lined with rotting wooden steps, descending into pitch-black darkness. The muffled sounds were louder now, and unmistakably human. Flashlights revealed a crude tunnel leading further underground. The officers descended slowly, weapons drawn. The walls were made of concrete and metal, reinforced by steel beams. What they found after 30 feet underground shocked them into silence. A prison. Cinder block cells, thick iron bars, and chains attached to the walls. Inside, barely visible, under flickering lights, were 4 emaciated men, pale, shivering, and silent. One lifted his head and tried to speak, but only air escaped his cracked lips. The nightmare had a voice, and it had finally been heard. The scene underground was unlike anything the officers had ever encountered. It wasn't a chaotic mess or a scene of random cruelty. It was disturbingly organized. The prison, though crude in its construction, had a clear layout. 3 small cells stood side by side, each enclosed with rusted bars, and locked from the outside with reinforced latches. The walls were stained with mildew, and the floor was damp, covered in a thin layer of mud and human filth. The air was nearly unbearable, thick with rot, sweat, and the unmistakable scent of decay. The 4 men inside were in terrible condition. Their hair was long and matted, their clothes nothing more than shredded rags. Each one showed signs of prolonged captivity. Emaciated bodies, bruises, old wounds, and psychological disorientation. One man stared blankly at the wall, unresponsive even when paramedics arrived. Another flinched at the sight of light, having been kept in near total darkness for so long. 2 were chained by the ankles to steel bolts in the ground. Their skin had grown raw around the cuffs. It was clear they hadn't seen sunlight in months, maybe years. Medical teams worked quickly to extract the men and assess their immediate condition. 3 could walk with assistance. 1 had to be carried out on a stretcher. Their mouths were too dry to speak, but their eyes told the story. A mix of horror, confusion, and fragile hope. Police widened the search area as forensic teams began analyzing the bunker. What they discovered added even more darkness to an already chilling mystery. Hidden inside a narrow side room, off the main tunnel, was a crude operations center. There was a workbench cluttered with tools, rolls of electrical wire, metal clamps, and hand-drawn diagrams of the bunker's construction. On the wall hung dozens of photographs, not of the prisoners, but of other men. Some looked like candid shots taken from a distance. Men waiting at bus stops, entering shelters, walking down alleys. Most had names scribbled beneath them, a few were crossed out. Others had red stars next to them. More alarming was a journal filled with detailed entries, times of feeding, punishments administered, psychological notes, and behavioral observations. It read more like a scientist's field log than the diary of a kidnapper. Each prisoner had been assigned a number, and each number had entries going back months. There were even notes on one man's resistance to routine, mentioning attempts at corrective silence and restraint training. Authorities realized they weren't dealing with an impulsive criminal or a chaotic madman. This was systematic, methodical. The person behind the underground prison had planned every inch. From the construction, to the routine, to the psychological manipulation. The hidden world beneath the burnt house had been alive and functioning in secret, possibly for years. And then came the most chilling discovery of all, a narrow tunnel blocked by a steel door at the far end. It had a key padlock and heavy bolts. Forensics began the process of cutting it open. Whatever was behind that door, it wasn't meant to be found. When investigators finally breached the locked steel door at the far end of the bunker, they were met with another shock. Behind it was a storage room, clean, organized, and fully stocked. Shelves lined the walls, holding rows of canned goods, vacuum-sealed food packets, bottled water, medicine, and hygiene supplies. The entire setup was precise, as if someone had designed it for long-term sustainability. In one corner stood a small generator with a backup fuel supply. Mounted on a high shelf were 5 more surveillance cameras, disconnected but still functional. A corkboard on the wall displayed another set of photographs, this time all of adult males. A few had sticky notes attached with handwritten dates, and notes like "Observe Weekly" or "Test Suitability." As officers combed through the supplies and notes, it became clear this wasn't a one-time operation. Whoever had built the underground prison had intended to keep expanding. More captives, more cells, more control. The photos and notes suggested a list of future victims, calculated steps outlining how and when each man would be approached or followed. The names belonged to missing persons across several states, many of whom had vanished without any clear trail. Some had never even been formally reported missing. They were transient, disconnected, and easily overlooked by society. That's why they were chosen. That's why no one came looking. Detectives turned their attention to the property records and ownership details. The burned house above had remained in legal limbo since the fire. But the land was quietly purchased 4 years earlier under a false name. The transaction led to a shell company with no real business, just a post office box in a nearby town. Digging deeper, they discovered surveillance footage from a hardware store in the area, showing a man, tall, average build, always wearing a hat, buying construction materials in bulk over several months. The receipts led back to one name, William Derren Hask. That name raised immediate red flags. Hask was a former contractor who had been questioned, but never charged. In the suspicious disappearance of a co-worker in another state nearly 6 years ago, after that investigation collapsed due to lack of evidence, he had seemingly disappeared from public life. There was no recent work history, no social media, and no tax records. But a few utility accounts had been quietly opened under aliases in his name. One of them belonged to a small house just 2 blocks from the hidden prison. Officers approached the residence with caution. It appeared unremarkable from the outside. A simple 2-bedroom home with a tidy lawn and closed blinds. But inside, they found the truth. The basement had been turned into a workshop, echoing the one beneath the burned house. Detailed blueprints were spread across a table. One was labeled Site B. There were tools, plastic restraints, a wall covered in surveillance stills, and a single, freshly marked calendar. The next date was circled in red. It was only 2 weeks away. The address listed belonged to a man who had just moved into town. His life, they realized, had nearly ended before it began anew. The discovery inside William Derren Hask's home deepened the horror of what was already an unimaginable case. The basement was not just a workspace. It was a command center. Each wall told a different part of the story. On one side, pinned photographs were arranged in a grid-like sequence, resembling a twisted family tree. Most of the photos were of men taken in everyday places: gas stations, alleys, park benches. Underneath each image were notes scrawled in red ink: dates, times, habits, physical health, and psychological remarks. Some had notes like non-combative, isolated, or responsive to control. It was clear Hask wasn't randomly selecting victims. He was profiling them, observing their behavior, and choosing based on how easily he could dominate and reshape them. Another wall held maps not just of Pine Grove but of surrounding towns and rural areas, and he had X marks and circled buildings. There were lines drawn between sites, as if he were mapping a larger network of operations. What alarmed detectives most was a manila folder labeled Expansion. Inside were sketch layouts for a larger underground structure, complete with multiple cells, communal areas, and what appeared to be a room labeled Re-Education. It suggested that Hask had intended to not only capture and detain, but mentally condition and control his victims long-term. Forensic teams found hard drives containing thousands of documents and images. Many were journal entries, long, rambling explanations of a personal philosophy. Hask referred to himself as a corrector, someone tasked with saving the world from moral decay by rebuilding it from the bottom up. In one entry he wrote, "Men are broken, but in silence they can be rebuilt, molded, transformed." These entries revealed a man who saw his actions not as criminal, but as purposeful, even noble, in his twisted view. As the data leaks circulated, the narrative surrounding Lena Voss began to shift. No longer was she the villain in a celebrity love triangle. Now she was viewed as a whistleblower, trapped in a web of deception far beyond her control. Online forums exploded with theories, while a small collective of journalists began piecing together timelines. What emerged was not a story of romance, but of engineered scandal with multi-million-dollar consequences. Brands that had endorsed Beckham, ranging from luxury watches to sportswear giants, were now being scrutinized, and their PR firms faced mounting questions. The public was no longer satisfied with silence. Then came the legal counterstrike. Lena filed a formal criminal complaint in Berlin. The targets of the complaint included her former PR agency, a Swiss-based media group, and a UK tabloid editor. The charges ranged from unlawful surveillance and coercion to participation in an organized defamation effort. The complaint outlined her recruitment, the fabricated branding role, the repeated setups, and her belief that the entire plot had been orchestrated to disrupt Beckham's image for financial gain, an image that held direct commercial value for multinational companies. While many expected the court to reject the complaint due to lack of jurisdiction or evidence, the opposite occurred. Authorities launched a formal inquiry, citing reasonable suspicion of organized media manipulation and psychological coercion. It wasn't just a publicity stunt anymore, it was a criminal investigation spanning multiple countries. A month later, British authorities confirmed a parallel investigation was being opened. They had received an anonymous cache of files that closely mirrored what Lena had released online, along with new material. One document was particularly damning, a presentation slide deck from a private PR consulting firm that listed anticipated scandal impact values next to Beckham's top 5 sponsors. It outlined potential stock fluctuations, recommended media angles, and even had Lena's name listed under narrative engagement assets. The sponsors panicked. One brand immediately paused its contract with Beckham, stating it would conduct an internal review. Others declined to comment. Beckham's legal team went on the offensive, calling the claims a fabricated campaign of disinformation. But their aggressive stance only added fuel to the fire. Public perception was shifting rapidly. People wanted answers. Meanwhile, Lena remained in hiding, under the protection of a whistleblower defense organization. The more details came out, the clearer it became that she had been chosen not for any wrongdoing, but because she was unknown, controllable, and easy to discredit. She had been the perfect vessel for a narrative she never agreed to write. By now, the scandal had moved beyond Beckham entirely. It was no longer about one man's reputation, but about the murky world where media, image, and money intersect. Lena had become a symbol of how easily public perception can be engineered and how the line between entertainment and manipulation was not just thin, but almost invisible. A year after Lena's last public appearance, the world had moved on, at least on the surface. The story that once dominated news cycles had been pushed aside by fresher scandals and new headlines. David Beckham returned to public life, his reputation largely intact, backed by his legal team and a tightly controlled media strategy. Most of the brands that had distanced themselves quietly resumed their partnerships. The investigations faded from front pages, court proceedings stalled, and no major arrests were made. The machine had absorbed the damage and kept moving. But beneath that polished surface, things had changed. Lena was no longer in Berlin. Following a confidential agreement with an international human rights group, she had been relocated under a witness protection program after receiving multiple threats, some subtle, others far more direct. Her disappearance wasn't just for her safety, it was also part of a deal. While her name was cleared in some circles, she had agreed to stop releasing additional materials. The pressure, legal threats, and fear had taken a toll. She wanted peace, even if it meant giving up the fight for full justice. But she didn't stay silent forever. 10 months after the scandal began, an investigative journalist named Edon Clare received an unmarked envelope containing a handwritten letter and a single flash drive. The letter was signed with a single name, Lena. The contents of the flash drive weren't explosive in the legal sense, no shocking new tapes or contracts, but what it contained was far more haunting, a detailed day-by-day account of Lena's experience. It's written like a journal, outlining every manipulation, every fake meeting, every moment she was made to play a part in someone else's narrative. In one entry, she described a moment of clarity in a hotel elevator, watching herself in the mirror and not recognizing the person staring back. In another, she wrote about waking up to find her phone wiped remotely, hours after receiving an encrypted file she never even opened. The final entry simply read, "They didn't need me to lie. They needed me to be seen so the world could lie for them." Iden published excerpts from the journal in a long-form piece titled "The Woman Who Wasn't Here There." It didn't trend, didn't go viral, but it reached the right readers, media watchdogs, legal experts, and whistleblower advocates. Slowly, the story found new life, not in breaking news, but in academic conferences, and media ethics panels, and university lectures. Lena's name faded, but her impact lingered. She had exposed a mechanism, an invisible system designed to manufacture belief and manipulate perception. She showed how easy it was to fabricate a scandal, to ruin someone's life, and to walk away without consequence. The truth didn't roar in this story. It whispered. And though the world might forget Lena Voss, the few who listened to her story would never look at headlines the same way again. Among the disturbing finds were medical supplies, syringes, sedatives, and restraining devices. There were feeding charts, sleep logs, and behavior modification schedules. He treated his captives like lab subjects. Several VHS tapes were labeled with names and numbers. Though authorities were hesitant to view them, the contents confirmed the worst. Footage of daily routines inside the bunker, feeding sessions, punishments, and long hours of surveillance as the captives sat or slept in silence. Each man was monitored like an animal in a cage. Back in the hospital, one of the surviving victims finally began to speak. Through tears and trembling, he told investigators about the rules. No speaking unless permitted, no standing during observation hours, and no asking for food or water. Disobedience was punished with isolation or worse. He confirmed that one of the men had died 6 months earlier and was taken to the dark room, presumably the area where the remains were found behind the sealed wall. Authorities realized Hask had developed a self-contained world beneath the surface. He believed he was saving his victims from society by forcing them to live in silence and obedience. The scariest part, everything suggested he wasn't done. His plans were bigger, bolder, and still in motion. and Hask was nowhere to be found. As days turned into weeks, the manhunt for William Derren Hask grew colder. Despite nationwide alerts and countless tips, no verified sighting emerged. He had vanished without a trace, but his presence lingered everywhere. In the evidence rooms, the victims' memories, and the growing fear that he might strike again. Authorities believed he had prepared for this moment, orchestrating his escape with the same precision he used to build his underground prison. Every discovery pointed to a larger plan, one that didn't end with Pine Grove. FBI analysts began piecing together data from Hask's hard drives, trying to anticipate his next move. Among the digital files, they found GPS coordinates, many of which led to nothing. Empty plots of land, rural farmlands, or forested areas. But one stood out. It was a remote piece of land in Vermont, tucked deep in the Green Mountains. Records showed it had been purchased in cash, under a fake identity years earlier, and neighbors reported rarely seeing anyone there. Just a few deliveries during the off-season and the occasional flicker of light from the woods at night. Local law enforcement, assisted by federal agents, quietly approached the location. They found a modest cabin, overgrown and isolated. From the outside, it appeared abandoned, but inside, dust hadn't yet settled on recently moved furniture. A fire had been lit recently, and the scent of food still lingered faintly. More importantly, under a worn rug, they found another trapdoor. This one led to a fresh, unfinished space. A mirrored bunker layout, identical to the one in Pine Grove, but even larger. The walls were newly reinforced, and the floors were still being tiled. Empty cages leaned against one wall. A row of packaged food supplies had already been stocked. 2 chains were already bolted into the ground. It wasn't a hiding spot. It was another prison, nearly ready for use. And the most haunting discovery of all was a small, laminated sign taped to the inside of the steel door leading down. It read Phase 2. Investigators now knew without a doubt that Pine Grove was just the beginning. Hask had been building a network, a series of hidden prisons designed to house his chosen subjects. The Vermont site was only the second confirmed location, but it likely wasn't the last. Back in Pine Grove, the surviving victims continued their long journey toward recovery. Though most avoided the public eye, one eventually released a statement thanking law enforcement for saving his life and urging people to pay attention to the ones no one is watching. The town remained haunted by the shadows of what had been discovered beneath its soil. Hask's name became infamous, the subject of headlines, documentaries, and late-night speculation. Was he dead? In hiding? Or watching his next victim right now from a distance? No one could say for certain. But one thing was clear. The screams heard that night didn't just expose a hidden prison. They exposed a calculated evil that could still be out there, silent and unseen, waiting to resurface.